Hi, and welcome to the lecture for Module 16, where we'll be focusing today on Picasso, Cubism, and other types of modernism before World War I. So we're in this moment after Post-Impressionism. Many of the Post-Impressionists become very influential to these figures, and this is a moment that is generally referred to as the Avant-Garde. In this period, we see an interest in pure forms and colors. So some of the styles we'll be talking about today include Expressionism, Fauvism, Cubism, Futurism, and De Stijl. So a lot to cover today, as always. We're still at the point when the center of the art world is Paris, and we'll talk about a number of things that are created outside of Paris as well, but we're almost exclusively in Europe at this point, even though, of course, things are going on in the United States. The major moments in the history of art are happening in Europe and again around the city of Paris. So the arts in this period in the 20th century, there's rapid changes occurring in response to social, economic, and political changes globally. This is a period of incredible uncertainty, anxiety, and change. The artistic styles include the avant-garde, which I used last time, but what that word means is that these are trailblazers who rejected the classical tradition and academic standards, exploring specifically the formal qualities of painting. These are movements that very quickly develop, merge, and evolve. Often these styles are in response to movements that came before or occurred at the same time, as well as to historical events such as the World Wars and the Great Depression. We also see an exploration of new materials, especially those that are developed through technological innovations. We see that through mass-produced materials, plastics, etc., and we'll see that even more with our next lecture. Also, there's an even greater global awareness, and we talked about this a bit with Gauguin, but there's an interest in primitive sorts of art. Again, I'm using that word in quotation marks, and there's a rise in ethnographic museums as well, especially museums that featured African art and artifacts from Oceania. Some of the major 20th century events to consider are the development of the consumer economy. This fosters decadence, class conflicts, corruption, elation, and anxiety, and eventually leads to the Great Depression. We also have revolutions and wars going on in this point. We see the Russian Revolution in the very early part of the 20th century, followed by the rise of communism, and then also World War I and eventually World War II as well. We also see advances in technology, including increased communication and transportation, even more so than during the 19th century, and this leads to an increase in the quality of life. We also see a rise in immunization and medicines. People are starting to live a little bit longer. Also, there's newly manufactured plastics and textiles. And finally, we also have an emphasis on the factory and assembly line production that comes out of the Industrial Revolution. So the first thing I want to talk about is this style called Expressionism, and that means an art that conveyed in a very broad range of styles and subject matters the subjective emotions and the innermost feelings of the artist. So the Expressionist artists of the 20th century built upon the developments of the Post-Impressionists, who had already rejected the Impressionist interest in objective truth to the internal world and imagination of the artist. Visually, we see diverse ways to approach this, but overall they relied on simple, powerful forms realized in a direct and sometimes crude expression designed to heighten the emotional response of the viewer. Many expressionists exhibited in what's called the Salon d'Automne, which was organized by avant-garde artists who didn't like conservative policies of the Paris Salon. This Salon d'Automne was begun in 1903 and then held annually. So right now we'll begin with Fauvism, and this was the first avant-garde movement of the 20th century. The word Fauvism comes from the French word fauve, which means wild beast. And the Fauves were a loosely organized group of artists in France who explored the use of saturated colors, expressive lines, and delicate patterns. The name was given to the group by a critic who first viewed their works at a 1905 exhibition, the Third Salon d'Automne. He commented on the strange juxtaposition of vibrant, colorful, and unnaturalistic paintings with a sculptural Italian bust. He saw in this exhibition a certain incongruity, and the thing that he said is Donatello parmi les fauves, which means Donatello among the wild beasts. because there was this single work of traditional sculpture in the exhibition, surrounded by all of these really brightly colored works of art. Fauvism is influenced by symbolist artists and also Van Gogh and Gauguin. These artists, Van Gogh and Gauguin, opened the way to a form of painting that freed the artist from the pictorial conventions established in the Renaissance, that is specifically illusionism, three-dimensionality through perspective, modeling through light and shadow, the concept, and this idea that the painting is a window onto the world. They're especially known for their use of color. We see these jarring patches of contrasting and highly saturated colors, often applied directly from the paint tube. And along with that, we see this expressive and textured brushstroke to express personal feelings and to create space and light. In other words, they freed color from its traditional role as describing nature and instead focused on the ability of pure color to communicate the artist's personal experience and emotions. The forms in paintings are built purely from color. This brought avant-garde art even closer to abstraction, which would be more fully achieved by the German expressionists, who we'll talk about a little bit later. Although for the most part, the Fauves still adhered to representational works, that is, they had some sort of subject. The leader of the Fauves was Henri Matisse. He was a French painter, sculptor, and writer, and he had varying subject matters, including nudes, landscapes, interior domestic scenes, portraits, and still lives. So the first work I'm showing you today is by Matisse. It's typically called Woman with a Hat, and it dates to 1905, so the same year that that word fauve became applied to the style of painting. So in this portrait, what we're seeing is Matisse's wife, but we see this focus on construction of the forms through color. There is some line present. You can see the outline of her shoulders, the outline of her hat, a bit of an outline of her hair, but the emphasis here is on the color. There's very little sense of setting behind her, very little notion of modeling, creating light and shadow in order to express three-dimensionality, and there's no perspective used here either. It's almost a mask-like depiction of the face through these patches of color. You should notice a chromatic unity between the background and the colors used for her face and clothing. And when this debuted, it caused quite a scandal because the Fauves weren't accepted very readily in the beginning. But this work was purchased by Gertrude Stein's brother. She was a famous writer living in Paris. And his status, Stein's brother's status, lent a certain reputation to Matisse's works. So I'm just showing you this one example of Fauvism, but this is a very good example of it. These really bright patches of color that don't actually seem to make a lot of sense. Hopefully you can also see in this image the texture and ability to see the brushstrokes. I think you can especially see it just below her face and her clothing. You can see these patches of color. In a lot of ways it reminds me of Cézanne, although it's not quite as cubic in the patches of color. Instead, this is more free form just a bit. But it's leading towards abstraction. I mean, we can absolutely see that this is supposed to be a portrait of a woman. You can make out the forms, but look at that background. It's almost like a color field painting. And that's something that comes many years in the future. So at the same time that the Fauves were further exploring the expressive and lyrical use of pure, unmodulated color, other branches of Expressionism were developing, primarily in Germany. In the first and second decade of the 20th century, you have two main German Expressionist movements. The first is called Die Brücke, which means the bridge, and the second is called Der blaue Reiter, and that means the blue rider. And we'll be talking about an example of both of these. The Expressionists in Germany also worked with the expressive potential of line, color, and brushwork, but their intense colors and forms conveyed an anguish and tension that was very different from the lyricism and poetic harmony of the Fauves in Paris. So you might notice in this painting that I'm showing you this bright use of color that doesn't necessarily make sense with what it's depicting, but there's also this sense of anxiety that's conveyed by the scenes of painters like Ernst Ludwig Kirchner that I'm showing you here in his painting, The Street from 1907, so just 2 years after Matisse's painting. So these expressionist groups formed in different cities in Germany, and they were typically living together and working incredibly closely with one another on artistic developments and experiments. So for each group, I've chosen a representative artist, but that doesn't mean there aren't other artists who they were working very close with to make these developments, or that couldn't also represent this movement. I just have to make choices in what I show you. So first we'll talk about Die Brücke with Kirchner. As I said, that means the bridge in German. And they named themselves that because they viewed themselves as the bridge between conventional or traditional art and modern art. It was organized by 4 German architecture students who established themselves as an artistic alliance or group in 1905 in the city Dresden. This was the same time as the Fauves in Paris. This group lasted until the outbreak of World War I and the rise of Dada, which we will talk about in our next lecture. Eventually, this group of artists, the center of Die Brücke, moves to Berlin. You can define Die Brücke as artists who are using bright, jarring color and harsh, angulated lines and forms in their art, and they focused on modern subjects of industry and urbanization. They wanted to develop a style that was new and modern, yet still shared ties to tradition. So you should see some echoes of Impressionism here and even some forms of Post-Impressionism. Their subjects often incorporated a sort of spiritual abstraction and medieval art, as well as African and Oceanic art, into modern European contexts. So Kirchner is one of the leading founders of Die Brücke in 1905. He typically painted depictions of contemporary and modern life, that is, often streets and inhabitants of the city, as well as the bohemian life of its nightclubs, cabarets, and circuses. He would draft the works on the spot and then rework them into paintings or prints in the studios. The subject that we're seeing here is a street scene in modern Dresden. It's teeming with people. It's crowded, yet these people are sort of drifting and directionless, it seems. There's this exuberant and expressionistic use of color. They're jarring and bright, especially you see this woman in this bright yellow, her face, this almost sickly shade of green. You see these other patches of really strongly saturated colors on the left side of the painting. So these jarring colors are aided by the use of complementary colors. The influence of Munch is particularly important for German expressionist artists. So think back to the scream from the last module. You still see this tilted perspective that the Impressionists and Post-Impressionists adopted. We also see sweeping lines and elongation of figures that's also similar to Munch. The distortion of forms also derived from non-Western artifacts and looking to Gothic models. The lines and the brushwork in the painting give a sense of movement, so it doesn't feel like a still snapshot of a scene. You can really get a sense that these figures are moving through space. It's a rather stressful and anxious image, one that acutely describes the condition of modern urban life. That is one of close physical proximity to other people around you, coupled with a sort of extreme psychological distance. So you're close to all these people, but you're really quite alone in the midst of it. And this is a characteristic of the years approaching World War I. Kirchner, among other artists, served in World War I for Germany, and that had a serious impact on the art world, which is something we'll talk about next time as well. Now I'd like to move on to the style called Der Blaue Reiter, which again means the blue rider. This was a name that was rather arbitrarily chosen, that derived from a book written jointly by 2 of its members. We can define Der Blaue Reiter as a more spiritual movement and more focused on the imagination than the gritty emotionalism of Die Brücke. Der Blaue Reiter was founded in Munich, Germany, and the artists here were more drawn to non-figurative abstraction. So we see a turn away from any really easily readable subject. So the figure that we'll be talking about with Der Blaue Reiter is Vasily Kandinsky. He is originally from Moscow, but he lived in Munich. In 1911, he formed Der Blaue Reiter with Franz Marc, who is also discussed in your textbook. They are among the first artists and Kandinsky especially, to eliminate recognizable objects from his paintings and move towards pure abstraction. He wanted to create an art that was spiritual and mystical and reflected his incredible intellectual capacity for contemporary scientific theory, music, and spirituality. Kandinsky wrote and published a book called Concerning the Spiritual in Art, where he discusses his theories about art, including his interest in the relations between music and art, and abstraction, and the dematerialization of the object, which he actually links to Monet. And this is the source that your supplementary reading comes from today. Kandinsky believed more than anything that art should be concerned with the expression of the spiritual rather than the material. At this time, scientific advances challenged traditional notions of the material world. He was very aware of the scientific developments of Albert Einstein, among others. He was very deeply spiritual and believed in theosophy. So in this work, titled The Panel for Edwin R. Campbell No. 4, it used to be known as Painting No. 201 Winter, dates to 1914, so a little bit of time after the movement was founded. In it, you can see this rhythmic use of line, color, and shape rather than any sort of narrative or object. It's one of 4 paintings he did with titles of the seasons. Kandinsky here eliminates all references to material reality and moves toward an elevated spiritual level through abstraction. This spiritual level was where the artist's creativity was drawn and in turn reflected the artist's spirituality. So it's this really intense look at the artist's spirituality. We really have a movement starting with the post-impressionists of the emotion of the artist being the major emphasis here. And I think that's how we think of art a lot today as well, and how artists are working today. In this painting, you see significant variation in types of lines. You see also lots of colors, lots of swirls and curves. You see a variety of color patches. Many have sort of mottled coloring, while the rest are sort of smoothly applied, like you can see in the top part of the canvas versus the sort of patchy, splashed on quality at the bottom of the canvas here. You see some very striking yellows and reds. These warm colors always stand out. They jump to the foreground, whereas cooler colors recede. And it's interesting that this is his winter painting, because I'm curious, do you get a sense of winter from this work? And this is a circumstance where I really wish I could lecture to you in person so that you could tell me what you think about this painting. Your book discusses the fact that there's a lot of white in this painting and the merging of colors into lighter tones. So each of the darker colors fades towards another version of itself, a similar hue that's got more white imbued in it, and that is an indicator of winter. But it's a kind of interesting concept that this is what he's trying to convey, but it's really up to the viewer what they see in it, no matter what title is given here. And notice that he very regularly titles his things something like Painting number 201 and then adds that subtitle Winter. Sometimes he doesn't do that at all. Sometimes he gives some sort of musical titles instead, because it's sort of the sense that he's trying to invoke rather than a subject. So now we're going to spend a good deal of time talking about the style called Cubism. And the work I'm showing you is generally referred to more as fitting into the proto-Cubist style rather than Cubism itself, but it's a very important transitional work. Cubism develops in the second decade of the 20th century, and it really is a crucial turning point in art history. It is the most radical break from the Renaissance convention of pictorial illusion and a very strong and true move towards abstraction. But this abstraction is quite different than something we saw with Kandinsky, which is focusing purely on form and almost no subject, no object that is the subject of the painting, whereas Cubism maintains that interest in an actual subject. The 2 artists you want to associate with the development of Cubism are Pablo Picasso and Georges Braque. And Braque was just as influential to its development. He's a French painter. Picasso is a Spanish painter who relocates to Paris and works there most of his life. But Picasso has become much more famous, and so he gets more credit. So what I'm showing you here is this painting called Les Demoiselles D'avignon, and this dates to 1907. In this work, we almost see him taking Cézanne to a new level. So think back to Mont Saint-Victoire and that color block painting he did there. Here we don't quite see cubism, but we're getting there. The subject we have here are female prostitutes in a brothel. And of course, that's a very broadly defined subject here. But it doesn't take place in France like you might think from the title, because Les Demoiselles d'Avignon means the girls from Avignon. Instead, this was an area, Avignon was an area of Barcelona, so it was probably supposed to recall this area of Barcelona where there were a number of brothels. I also wanted to show you this study for the work to show you how significantly it changed. You can get a sense on the right side here of figures that do stay in the painting, as well as some of the objects instilled within, especially this plate with fruit on it. You see two other women over here. But notice that there's also two clothed figures, and I hope that brings to mind Manet for you. Originally, Picasso was going to include male clients, but he continually reworked the piece over and over. And he had a greater concept in mind concerning painting and the purpose and properties of painting, rather than conveying a particular illusionistic scene. But it's interesting to me that we see him starting in this way, making a more narrative subject. You see this figure coming in on the left. He's pushed this curtain back. Artists love to use curtains as this device in paintings. And then you see another man in the very center, and they're surrounded by these very abstracted forms of these women. So again, I want to emphasize this concept of reworking. This is a very important part of Picasso's process, reworking the space and volume. So the figures on the right side have stayed quite consistent from the preliminary sketch, but then the women on the left side are quite different. Here on the far left, you have a woman who is now sort of taking the place of the male figure who had been standing here with her arm up, holding this curtain back. In this painting, we see Picasso using the lessons of Cézanne as well as a new sort of influence. Specifically, that is his interest in African and Iberian masks. Remember, I talked about the rise of ethnographic museums in this time period. This is another very good example of primitivism, maybe even more directly so than somebody like Gauguin. And what primitivism means is this incorporation in early 20th century art of stylistic elements from artifacts of Africa, Oceania, or the native peoples of the Americas. So in Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, he breaks apart the figures and objects and the space into intersecting planes. There's no real sense of depth. The only way we get any sense of depth is by the overlapping just a little bit of some of the figures. Even the setting has been fragmented into these broken areas of color. The women's forms have also broken up in this way, especially with the figures on the right side, the ones that have the most mask-like faces, but you can really argue that for any of the women in the scene. The space and the volume becomes almost indecipherable here. Picasso is emphatically reasserting two-dimensional nature of the painted surface. So we talked about this considerably with Manet, with realism, the Impressionists, and the Post-Impressionists. So again, I want to highlight this important influence of ancient and non-Western art that he's emphasizing. So the three women on the left, their faces are a bit more simple. They're calm. There's more planar aspect to their faces that recalls Iberian sculpture. And the Iberian Peninsula is Spain and Portugal. So primitive cultures from that area. Whereas the two faces on the right, their colors and patterns are derived from African masks. The figures, as I said, are broken even further into intersecting planes and multiple viewpoints, especially this figure who is squatting down here. I can't tell, it almost looks like we're looking at her back rather than her front, and yet her face is turned around. There's very little sense of a body except in the most basic shapes that he's depicted here. So this painting, think of it as the beginnings of Cubism, which would begin officially when Picasso worked with Georges Braque a year later in 1908. And I just want to make this comparison to remind you that Manet is one of these first artists who is making things much more planar, emphasizing the two-dimensionality of art. Remember, I talked about the sort of abstracted forms and patternings in the background of Olympia, flatten out the space. And Picasso is taking that to a completely different level. He's hardly got an indication of any space at all. Again, you've got that curtain. The artists love the use of the curtain as an illusionistic device, but I don't know how illusionistic Picasso's work can be considered. You have very similar subject matters between these two works, this look at a prostitute or prostitutes, but Picasso is approaching it in a significantly different way. And this is just a product of their time and developments of art and the avant-garde. Picasso wouldn't be at this point if it hadn't been for somebody like Manet and other artists like Cézanne. Now I want to talk about actual cubism. There's two different forms, which I will define for you. With cubism, we have this radical rejection of pictorial illusionism and an emphasis instead on an object's shapes and forms. It's quite abstracted, and the forms begin to merge into one another. It's a rejection of naturalism, perspective, and traditional space and volume. The name came from Matisse, actually, when he described it in French as avec des petits cubes, which means with some little cubes, as describing how the works were composed. There's two phases, as I said, two different types of cubism. The earlier one is referred to as Analytic Cubism, and that's what we're starting with this painting by Braque. And the second is called Synthetic Cubism. In both of these, we also do have sculpture, but I'll be focusing more on painting. So here we're looking at Georges Braque's Violin and Picture, which dates from 1909 to 1910. And as I said, this is an example of Analytic Cubism. This was mostly achieved through painting. And Analytic Cubism is this first phase in which form is broken and analyzed from every possible viewpoint. It's quite monochromatic to focus on form rather than to evoke any emotional responses from the viewer through a device such as color. The various viewpoints of an object are pictorially combined into one image in order to create one complete pictorial whole. So in this painting, for example, you have a violin and a pitcher, which you can make out the violin here in the front, the pitcher here. And with Cubism, in this painting, Braque is trying to demonstrate that this is a whole object, even though a painting normally represents it in a two-dimensional way. It doesn't mean that there's not a backside to the violin. It doesn't mean that the curving edges of the pitcher don't matter. So in Cubism, they try to show all of the sides of an object at once by flattening out its forms into patches of color. And again, you should see the influence of Cézanne in this image and the color block painting that we saw with Mont Saint-Victoire. Typically in Analytic Cubism, you have the paintings named for the objects that it's based on. Always in Analytic Cubism, you can get a sense of the objects, but they're significantly fragmented. On the right side of this, you can probably also get a sense of a table next to this violin and this vertical element of a wall in the background. The subject is almost unrecognizable because this is almost complete abstraction, but he does provide us with subtle clues. Light and shadow is present, but it enhances the tension of space versus a normal two-dimensional painting that's trying to use light and shadow to recreate a three-dimensional illusion. You have some overlapping areas that inhibit a sense of recession and modeling. Often with Analytic Cubism, you also have a stenciling of letters and numbers, which really jump to the surface of the painting. We're not seeing that in this painting in particular. It emphasizes the tension of the two-dimensional form as well. Often you see quite playful messages in this, so even though there's a tension to form and the notion of two-dimensionality versus three-dimensionality, they don't take themselves completely seriously. But we do have a tension between representation and abstraction. Now I want to show you my favorite example of synthetic cubism. I don't really like your book's example of synthetic, so I wanted to show you one by Picasso that I think represents it really well. Synthetic cubism developed in 1912, so the same year as this image I'm showing you. It's where the cubists moved away from painting and towards collage. What they did is they combined elements from paintings, drawings, and other materials to engage in pictorial issues, to really contemplate the idea of images. So what I mean is that instead of painting a newspaper, why don't you just cut and paste a newspaper onto the canvas? So the work I'm showing you here is titled Still Life with Chair Caning, and again it dates from 1912, and we're looking at a work by Picasso. Picasso initiated this synthetic phase of Cubism. So it's mostly a painting, which you can see in the top part here, but also you see at the bottom this piece of oilcloth that's had printed on it this pattern of a cane chair. So it's not actual chair caning in the image, but something that very much looks like it, and it's a completely different medium than the painting around it. The entire thing is then framed with a piece of rope, an actual piece of rope. Synthetic cubism takes on the challenges of representation that we saw with analytical cubism, but it takes it to a new level and challenges the viewer's perception of what is real. So that chair caning seems quite real, but he's put paint on top of it to indicate that it is just as flat as everything else. So images can trick you in a way. You also see the stenciling that I mentioned that sometimes occurs with analytic cubism. Here we have the letters J-O-U, Jou, which can mean maybe a few different words. It might be an abbreviation of a few different words in French, including journaux, journey, or jouer, to play, or jouir, to enjoy. So there is this really playful aspect to Cubism. Even though it's this pivotal moment in art, they're not taking themselves that seriously. They're not wanting the viewer to take this completely seriously. This is not an academic type. In the painting, the abstract strokes of paint are the most real thing, because that is what it actually is. The print of chair caning is not actually chair caning. The frame is not really a frame, it's a piece of rope, but a painting is made of paint. So the most real thing here is the paint itself. So this interest in exploring how artists can say new things about the medium in which they work. Painting has now been around for centuries at this point and has been very well developed. And so artists are beginning to break into abstraction and playing around with the medium. I now want to talk about the movement referred to as Futurism. It began as a literary movement in 1909 in Italy by the Italian poet and playwright Filippo Tommaso Marinetti. It eventually makes its way into all of the arts, including the visual arts. It's unlike Cubism in that it was driven not by artistic exploration, but by the socio-political environment in Italy before World War I. The Futurists advocated change, revolution, war, and technology, and they encouraged the destruction of cultural institutions. Italy was in a serious cultural and political decline in the early part of the 20th century, and the Futurists thought that war would wipe the slate clean. They were especially interested in modern technology, and often in their works they represent speed, motion, and technology. In the style, we see this interest in motion in time and space, and it's similar to the Cubist analysis of form and space, but I'm showing you here a three-dimensional example. That is by Umberto Boccioni, and it's called Unique Forms of Continuity in Space, dated to 1913. And I think that you can see that it captures the sensation of motion in space. And this is something that they expressed was an aim of their art in one of many manifestos they wrote. So here we start to see artists actually writing about their work and telling you what they were trying to achieve. We saw the same thing with Kandinsky in his writings about the spiritual. We see here this figure in full stride. You get this sense of movement through space captured by breaking the figure into planes, so something similar with Cubism or even paintings like Cézanne's works. And the planes extend outward from the sculpture to really give it a sense of movement. You also have a very highly reflective bronze surface that enhances this effect. The effect is this sort of blur of movement, and you see this in most Futurist works. My favorite work by the Futurists is called The Dynamism of a Dog on a Leash, and you can really get a sense of the movement of this little dachshund's legs that are just going a million miles a minute. So one of the things that Boccioni wrote about his work in the technical manifesto of Futurist sculpture, he said, "Let's proclaim the absolute and complete abolition of finite lines and the contained statue. Let's split open our figures and place the environment inside them. We declare that the environment must form part of the plastic whole." So the sculpture is not just itself, but is defined by everything around it. So the Futurists are really doing this unique thing in Italy, and it's a movement that's really broken up by World War I because many of them end up fighting in it and dying in World War I. Now, after living in Italy for almost 2 years, it's a really fascinating thing to imagine in this country because they're so engaged with their own history. And the Futurists wanted to destroy museums and archives and libraries and start over fresh. And it's impossible to imagine in this setting, in this city of Rome, where their history is just right in front of their faces. I also work in the archives a lot, and they are the best people at documenting their own history and what's going on in the world around them. So the Futurists are really different from the culture that they sprung out of. Finally, I want to talk about an artistic movement that is one among many that are focused even more on formalism than what we've discussed previously. These three specifically are Suprematism, De Stijl, and Abstract Expressionism. Suprematism and De Stijl both promoted utopian ideals, the idea that painting could help lead to a better society. And this is even more abstract than previous movements, with a strict interest in basic forms. So I mentioned at the beginning of the lecture that I'd be talking about De Stijl. I wrote out that slide and completely forgot that instead of De Stijl, I want to talk about Suprematism. I want to make sure you're clear that that word is Suprematism and not Supremacism. That's a very different thing. So I'm showing you a work by the major Suprematist artist Kazimir Malevich, and this work is entitled Black Square, and it dates to 1929, this work I'm showing you, but the original was created in 1915. Suprematism appears in Russia in the cusp of the Russian Revolution. Even though the major Russian centers are geographically quite far from Paris, remember, which is the center of the art world, they are still aware of what's going on with Cubism because of prominent collectors in Russia. As I said, the major proponent of the style of Suprematism is Malevich. In 1913, Malevich said he was trying to free himself from the object in art and sought, quote, refuge in the square form, unquote. So the square became the foundation of all of his paintings. Malevich in this work sought an even more pure form of painting than is found in Cubism. We see here an utter reliance independence on line, and his line and color are intended to give a pure feeling that is unencumbered with the study of a physical object. So relying on an object, in Malevich's opinion, made the work less pure. He wanted to liberate beauty in art that had been suppressed by a devotion to naturalism. As I said, this is not the original work, but he made later versions of this painting. He first showed it in 1915. The black in this painting was meant to be a symbol of pure feeling, or the cosmic, while the white was meant to give the sense of a void without feeling. So pure feeling layered on top of no feeling. He thought this would be easily understandable to the viewer, as he thought the symbols were universal. He also believed his art could play a major role in the reforming of society after the 1917 revolution in Russia, but the leaders of the country thought that a new Russia needed a more practical art. He doesn't have a manifesto per se, but he wrote a book called The Non-Objective World, where he explained the philosophy of Suprematism. Suprematism and many of the other styles, including De Stijl, which is discussed in your textbook and epitomized by the artist Mondrian, none of this would have been possible without Cubism. This just wouldn't make any sense without the work of Braque and Picasso exploring the splitting up of objects into their most basic forms. So this formalism of the 20th century is something we'll continue to talk about, especially when we get to somebody like Jackson Pollock and abstract expressionism. So today we focused on these moments after post-impressionism, specifically with works of art generally classified as the avant-garde, so going against what had come before and breaking new ground in art. We see a distinct interest in formalism, in pure forms and colors, in expressionism with the works of the artists in the groups Die Brücke and Der Blaue Reiter. We also talked about Fauvism, which is another form of Expressionism with Matisse. We also discussed Cubism, this major breaking from tradition and this really pivotal turning point in the history of art. We also talked about Boccioni and Futurism, this idea of technology and movement and destroying the past. And instead of De Stijl, we talked about Suprematism, where there's this emphasis on pure form, line, and color. So now, to finish Module 16, please take the self-assessment. You'll find journal entry number 8 on Blackboard. And finally, the vocabulary wiki is the responsibility of group 3. Don't forget that we will have our synchronous meeting on Friday at 12 p.m. Eastern Time. This week, you also have part 3 of your final paper due, where you'll need to exchange your work with somebody else in the class, read each other's drafts, and send them back to each other as soon as possible. This is something you'll be turning in along with the final version of your own paper. And also do not forget that after our synchronous meeting, I'll be mailing you the weekly quiz, and that will be due by midnight on August 11th. So thank you for watching and listening, and I will see you at our synchronous meeting.